Hello everybody, and welcome back once again to Mountain Computers. Today I'm here to do a $1,300 PC build log using a Ryzen processor. It's going to be my first interaction with personally owning an AMD processor, and I'm personally pretty excited about it. So I guess, what do you do with a build log? I guess you start out with the specs. We're going to roll the intro, and right after that we'll jump right into the specs. Here we go. Okay, now that we have the specs down, let's take a look at what tools you're going to need to do this build. Building a PC these days is as easy as ever, so probably the biggest thing you're going to need is just a Phillips head screwdriver. Depending, you may also find use in a pair of scissors or side cutters, and maybe a pair of needle nose pliers too, but today I think I'm pretty much just going to wind up using the Phillips head screwdriver. While I'm not working in an anti-static workstation, you should be when you're building your computer, and I take absolutely no responsibility for anything that you damage because you're not. Without further ado, I guess let's get started.
To start out your build, you want to partially build your system outside of the case to test the essential components and make sure that they're functioning correctly. Take your motherboard out of its box. Remove it from the gray anti-static bag, close your motherboard box, and then place the board on top of it. Now you'll want to turn your attention to the CPU box. Open your box and what you'll find are the stock AMD cooler and a black box containing your processor. Take your processor out of the box and the plastic sheath, being especially careful not to bend any of the delicate pins on the bottom of it. Avoiding contact with the pins altogether is generally a good idea. Now, you'll want to raise the retention arm for your AM4 socket on your motherboard. This can be done by pressing the arm down below the retention hook, swinging it out and away from the socket, and allowing it to rise upward of its own accord. Now, insert the CPU in such a manner that the corner of the processor, which has a golden triangle emblazoned upon it, matches with the corner of the socket that features a similar marking. Note that you should not have to push the processor into the socket, but rather simply drop it in, as the socket uses zero insertion force. Once you've completed the insertion, you can now lower the retention arm back into place, locking it in its original position. Next thing you'll want to grab is your RAM. To insert the RAM, move the retention clips at the top of the DIMM slots to the outward position. Next, position your memory module so that the two ends are centered above the slot, and the notch in the memory module aligns with the matching notch in the slot. Now, press down on both ends of the module, make sure that the retention clip has fully engaged the memory module and that the stick is fully inserted at both ends. The next step is optional, but is a precautionary step to make sure that your CPU has adequate cooling during the power-on self-test process. It's not typically necessary, however some people may prefer to do this to protect their processor. What is this step, you ask? Well, it's mounting your stock cooler on the CPU. In order to do this, you'll want to unscrew the older mounting hardware from the motherboard while leaving the integrated backplate. Now, since your cooler should already have some pre-applied thermal paste on it, simply position the cooler over the board in such a manner that the screws line up with the mounting through holes. Now, begin to screw in the cooler using the Phillips head screwdriver. You should do this in a crisscross manner, so as to ensure that you don't damage the processor's heat spreader, or worse, the CPU die underneath. Make sure that the screws are tightened so that they are snug, but don't over-tighten them. Next, you'll need a graphics output device, so grab your graphics card, depress the retention clip on your motherboard's PCIe 16-lane slot, remove the red slot cover on the graphics card, and insert it into the PCIe slot. Make sure that the retention clip locks back into place. Be careful not to rock the graphics card back or forth too much, as it's not properly supported in this configuration. Last major step before you power on the system for the first time is to connect the power supply. So connect the 24-pin motherboard power, the 8-pin CPU power, and the 8-pin PCIe power lines to their respective receptacles. You want to make sure that the locking connectors on each engage correctly. Now, take a monitor, turn it on, and plug its display cable into your graphics card. Turn on your power supply, and jump these two pins on your motherboard using your screwdriver to turn on the system. The fans should start to spin up, and around half a minute or so later you should see the monitor kick into action and start displaying your system's boot up.
So there, you can finally see the system booted up. It took a nerve-wrackingly long amount of time, for sure. And I actually decided to stop and reseat my RAM. I think that I actually did have an issue with seating the RAM, so you want to make sure that you definitely have those DIMMs smashed all the way in often.
If your system doesn't turn on at first, don't worry. Ryzen chips have a notorious reputation for taking forever to perform their first post. But if given due time and your system still doesn't boot up, you'll want to turn off the system using the power supply and try troubleshooting to find an issue. Speaking of turning off your system, for those of you whose systems did turn on, congratulations, your system is now working. So you'll want to turn off the machine by switching the power supply off. You can now remove your power supply cables from the motherboard and graphics card, as well as remove that graphics card you inserted by pressing down on the mounting clips and pulling the item out. If you opted to install the AMD stock cooler, you can now go ahead and remove it. Remember to move in a crisscross manner. Clean the thermal paste off the CPU heat spreader and the cooler by using some isopropyl alcohol applied to a lint-free rag or a good paper towel. Keep the back plate on the motherboard And now would be a good time to install the cooler standoffs for your AM4 mounting system hardware included with your liquid cooler. You can now set aside all the parts we've been working on and focus your attention on the case. Start by removing the side panels by unscrewing the captive thumb screws that hold them in place, and then pulling them back until they come free. Store these in a place where they will not get scratched up. Untie the accessories box from the front of the case, set it aside where it'll be handy. Now remove the bottom air filter, the front facade, and the front air filter from the case. Take your motherboard's I/O shield and install it in the back of the case. Make sure that all four corners pop into place correctly. Now, since Fractal Design has pre-installed the motherboard standoffs, you can go ahead and drop the motherboard into place. Do that by lowering it into the case at an angle with the front side raised. Align the rear I/O with the I/O shield and lower the board onto the standoffs. From there, screw the motherboard into place using the motherboard screws found in the case accessories box. Now, you'll want to hook up your front panel I/O. So follow the manual to hook up the power switch and LED, reset switch, and hard drive activity LED in the right spots. Make sure that you mind the polarity on the LEDs, as they will only work if you plug them in the right way. Also, hook up your front panel USB 3 and HD audio headers. Now is also a good time to untie the pre-installed fan cables and hook them into the fan splitter included with the case accessories. Then plug that into the fan header in the upper right corner of the motherboard. Next, you can install your graphics card. To do this, unscrew and remove the PCIe slot blanks at the back of the case. Align the back of the card with the back slots and drop it into place on the motherboard, while also making sure that the PCIe bus slot lines up with the motherboard slot and engages the lock. Hold the back end of the card up while you screw the card into place. Now you can install your CPU cooler. For this part, if this is your first build, you may want to track down a friend, as this can be a tricky step. Track down the fans, screws, and washers included with your AIO cooler. Now comes the tricky part. You'll want to rotate and align your fan so that it pulls air from the outside of the case inwards, while feeding the fan through the cable management hole. Then align and press the radiator, tubes leading out from the top, against the fan so that you can fit the screws through the fan into the radiator. Now do just that, and make sure that you can screw the radiator in tight enough that it won't fall out or vibrate and rattle too much. But again, don't over tighten it and strip the threads in the radiator. Once you've accomplished that, align the other fan, also breathing air in, cable manage it, and screw it in. Now you can install the CPU block. There should be thermal paste pre-installed on this, just like your stock cooler. You'll want to swap the pre-installed LGA 1150X mounting bracket with the AM4 one. Do this by twisting the bracket, then pulling it off, and then install the new one doing the same in reverse. Now, plant the block down on the CPU, making sure that the mounting bracket's holes line up with the standoffs put in place earlier. Now, screw on the retention caps. You can tighten them with your screwdriver, but be very sure not to over tighten them or your CPU will run hotter than it should and you won't achieve any exceptional overclocks. Now, feed your female fan leads through the cable management hole above your motherboard and connect them to the two radiator fans. Connect the male lead to the motherboard's water pump header and coil the excess wire in between your CPU block and RAM. Lastly, connect the mini USB lead to the bottom of the block and the USB to front panel header. Next step will be mounting the drives. Remove the 3.5-inch drive mounting plate using the thumb screw, then screw in the hard drive using the 3.5-inch drive mounting screws. Now, put the drive back into place and rescrew the thumb screw. Next, remove the 2.5-inch drive mounting plate. Screw the solid-state drive and solid-state hybrid drive into place using the 2.5-inch drive mounting screws, and then replace that mounting plate too. Now you can attach your SATA data cables. You can use the two included with your motherboard for 2 of the drives, but you'll have to supply 1 more yourself. You'll also need to install your power supply. To do this, slide your power supply in from towards the front of the case by the pump mount, Then slide it back into place and screw it in from the back, using the PSU mounting screws included with the case. Now, feed all of the cables, except for the PCIe cable, through the big cable management hole right next to the power supply. Run the CPU and motherboard power cables through the respective cable management holes and plug them in. Route the Molex and one SATA power cable around the back so that they're out of the way. Then run the remaining SATA power cable around to power the two 2.5-inch drives. On the third power connector, attach the SATA pass-through power supply for the cable mod lighting kit. Connect the other end of the pass-through to the 3.5-inch drive. Now, attach the remote receiver via the barrel jack on the lighting power supply. To that, attach the splitter cable, minding the polarity, and cable manage that between the 140mm fan and the radiator. Snip your 60mm LED strip in two at exactly the halfway point. There should be some copper marks on the top of the cable at that point. At this point, you can grab your windowed side panel, stick the LED now strips to the top and bottom with the connectors facing the front of the case. Attach the two ends of the splitter cable to the strips, remove the protective plastic from the side panel, and put the side panel back onto the case and tighten the thumb screws. Lastly, make sure that all your cables on the back side of the case are routed so that they won't obstruct the other side panel from being put in place. Once you've tidied it up, put the other side panel back on, plug it in, test it out, and if you've done everything correctly and it turns on, congratulations, you've got a new computer. So, now that the computer's built, I've been using it for about a month. In one of my upcoming videos, I'll be taking a look at how the build performs compared to my old rig, and a few of the hiccups that I've experienced with it. But as for what I have time to say right now, I think it's a pretty great build overall. I built it in the Mini-ITX form factor so that I could pack it back and forth to college easier, and it's definitely a lot lighter than my old system. Aesthetically, it's pretty great, except I'm not totally sold on the red accents that the motherboard has. I'm considering painting those with some self-etching primer, because I just don't like the way they match the other stuff very well. And I'd love it if there were a better place to route the PCIe cable, because I just think it's kind of ugly where it is, but I guess if I had to fix that, I'd have to come up with some kind of way of fashioning my own basement. I can tell you that so far I'm pretty pleased with the performance of the 1700, and it's putting up a pretty good showing. I've been facing some stability and thermal issues, but I'll save that for the other video. For now though guys, thanks for watching. Definitely let me know what you thought of the build in the comments below, and while you're on the way down there, hit that like and subscribe button so you can stay up to date on everything else coming out. You've been watching Mountain Computers, and I hope I'll see you guys next time.